One's our Subsea Atlantic and Mediterranean focus. And before we start, I'd just like to thank all of our sponsors again for helping to make this event possible. And we've got another great group of speakers for you here. So I'm going to hand over now to Mike Conradi, who's the co-chair of International Telecoms and a partner with DLA Piper.
Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. It's great to be back at ITW. My name is Mike Conradi. I'm the co-chair of the Telecoms practice at global law firm DLA Piper. Even within Telecoms, I've got a particular specialism in and passion for submarine cables. I get teased about it by my colleagues at the work. I have the maps on my wall and samples on my desk, but I realize I'm in the company of many other fellow geeks who know a lot more about it than I do. Speaking of geeks who know a lot more about it than I do, I'm very pleased to introduce our panel. Given that we've got a limited time, I think the best thing to do would be for me to ask the first question and then invite the panelists, before answering it, to give a brief introduction to themselves, if that would be okay with everyone. And so my first question is, we're talking today about the Atlantic and Mediterranean. What are the particular challenges of doing submarine cable business in that region? I mean, let's just start with Nigel and move up the line.
Thanks very much. I obviously read the brief wrong and thought it was dress Mediterranean and come and talk about the Atlantic. But look, Nigel Bailiff, Aquacomms, in and around the Atlantic for a long, long time with Cable and Wireless and Flag and different companies. The challenge really is that it's a volume market, and there was this big aberration 20 years ago where lots of people built cables for a market which didn't really exist, and the consequence of that was a subsequent rotation through different bankruptcies of some of the assets and a huge reduction in the sort of ownership costs of some of those, therefore the price of the base product. But it's a good market in the fact that it is a huge volume market connecting massive industrialized North America with Europe. So there's always volume to come, and that's obvious with what's been happening with some of the new builds with the hyperscale construction companies. So, is it a challenging market? Yes, but all markets are challenging, and you have to cut your cloth to suit your market. So, we started in the Atlantic 2014-15 and have continued to grow there and now branch out from the Atlantic. So it almost is a relief to get to markets that aren't quite the same as the Atlantic. So for us, it's a challenge, but it's okay.
Thanks. Greg?
Yes, as Greg Verisco with Centurion, and we're focused across the Med, kind of the Indian Ocean region on into Asia with the project that we're doing, Trans-Europe-Asia. And so we get a bit of that Mediterranean, making sure that we get to the right places. Our business is very much focused on data center connectivity and providing diversity to these large data centers and the developing places, as we heard from the last session, these mini hubs that are part of this mesh network to provide the reliability that everyone needs for the type of growth that we're seeing in the industry. Obviously, that growth brings a lot of value to the market, and with that value, if you have data centers that are worth a lot more, you have to have diversity to ensure its continuity. And so we're very focused on that, and in bringing in new corridors, if I can use that term, and I'll use that term in relation to uncorrelated risks between systems. So if you have a corridor and it's all through the same jurisdiction, those risks are very much correlated, potentially. And so if you build separate corridors, and I appreciate Nigel's challenge on the Atlantic as he finds different corridors that are uncorrelated, and having been a part of some of the early builds there on the Atlantic, you want to make sure that you're not seeing those risks that would take out a system, and making sure that you're not impacted by the diversity routes. And so there's jurisdiction separation, there's geographic separation, there's a lot of things to consider, suppliers, partners, and the whole thing to have that type of reliability.
So this concept of a corridor you're talking about is it's not the same as a route. It's a kind of a narrow bit of land through which where there's similar risks in build and similar challenges in building and maintaining a cable along that in that region. Is that all along that route? Is that have I understood
correct,
right?
yes. And so you may have multiple systems through a corridor for reliability in that corridor and for capacity's sake. But then if a data center is really going to have that uptime and availability, they need to have those multiple corridors.
So Centurion has discovered a new corridor?
We're working on one, and we are announcing sections as we get those developed from Europe to Asia, and we're very excited about hopefully making a bigger announcement later this year.
Okay, well, I was going to ask you if you'd make it now, but it sounds like I'm not going to get you to do that. Okay, Mike, please introduce yourself and answer the question.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Mike Cunningham from Cross Lake Fiber. Cross Lake Fiber is a developer, owner, operator of long-haul routes between large metros that have a submarine component. In terms of the challenges experienced in the subsea industry, I mean, on the supply side, I think on a relative basis, being in the North Atlantic, it's an easier place in terms of the entire world, just because you've got a lot of different sources of supply. So every system is challenging to develop. We've seen the timeframes to develop systems shorten, but on a relative basis, I'll say it's...
Sorry, Mike, can I just interrupt? Can I ask you to speak closer to the microphone? I'm having trouble hearing you.
Sure. That better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So on a relative basis, I think that the Atlantic has some natural advantages that makes it easier, and the challenges with developing a cable are general to the industry. I also think from a market perspective, you know, and Nigel alluded to it, you had such an overbuild 20 years ago that now you're seeing, you know, in the future, definitive ends of life for a lot of that infrastructure that needs to be renewed. So while it's maybe a bit tougher from a permitting regulatory perspective to develop that infrastructure because you don't have that institutional memory with a lot of the authorities, I think that it's a good time to be in the business because you've got that requirement to meet increased demand while you're seeing infrastructure retire.
And remind us which route Cross Lake is building on?
From the UK, London to Paris.
Thanks. And Kieran?
Hey guys, good to be back at ITW. It's nice to be back in person, seeing everyone for a change. So I'm the COO for EXA Infrastructure. We operate a large subsea network from the US into Europe and several smaller submarine systems in Europe. We built our first system early 2000, so we went to RFS on our first 2 Atlantic cables in 2001, and then there was another 14 years before we built our next system. I think I certainly agree with Mike and a couple of the guys that there's a bit of catch-up. I think a lot of these systems were overbuilt back in the day. There was a long pause where nothing was being built, and now we're certainly seeing the catch-up across the different carriers, and really, I guess it kind of brings, in terms of challenges, it brings a supply challenge. We're seeing a lot of changes in our industry, in every industry, in terms of manufacturing and materials and delays, and so your planning cycles have to be a lot different these days. A couple of other challenges are really, we certainly know that demand is there, but one of the challenges is really kind of matching the submarine industry and a lot of cables landing, as we see, with multiple pairs and a lot more pairs than we used to see. But the real challenge is creating those high available, resilient backhaul networks to match the subsea landing. So I think that's certainly a challenge that a lot of the providers have to catch up on and make sure that the provision is certainly met to meet the submarine landing. So that's certainly a challenge that I would see. So generally collaboration and planning cycles have, you know, there's something we really have to think about as we're building new systems these days.
And so collaboration being important, I think it brings us nicely on to Meta and to Gary. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us about the challenges?
Yeah, so my name's Gary Waldsworth from Meta Platforms. Thank you very much for inviting me here. So, listening to the previous comments, I'll try and pick something different. So there are 3 particular things I might want to raise in terms of challenges in this particular region. One's on permitting, the second one's on maintenance and operation, And let's go to the third one on supply and demand. So on the first one on permitting, yeah, we still see challenges on permitting, and that means delays on obtaining permits, difficulty in predicting how long permits take, which makes a whole challenge for the whole forecasting and the whole efficiency of the business. Some jurisdictions are great. We love working in some jurisdictions. Others are very difficult. Unfortunately, the US is one of those, so it's very difficult for us to avoid it. We're also seeing jurisdictional creep outside of the territorial water limit jurisdiction out into the EEZ, particularly if it's a non-landing jurisdiction, where we're now having those challenges to manage, which we didn't have to manage before. They need to be taken into account, or wherever possible, avoided. Sometimes it is impossible to avoid an EEZ crossing of a cable. Moving on quickly to the maintenance and operation, we're seeing a decline in the readiness and capability of the maintenance available to us for cables we already have in the water and cables we're about to put in the water. You know, cables are put in the water and they last 20 years probably before they start to become uninteresting to operate. And most of the maintenance vessels we have won't last that long. So we're working very hard with partners we're operating with, you know, not just partners in terms of the supply side, but also partners on the operational side, such as Kieran next to me, to try and push those suppliers to invest more heavily in new vessels, in new techniques. But unfortunately, that means that we have to pay more. We recognise that, and that is something that we have to do. Otherwise, we're going to end up with no way of maintaining the internet across the Atlantic, which will be really bad news for pretty much everyone in this room. Lastly, supply demand. We are seeing a challenge in what we want, to get what we want as quickly as we want and as big as we want. So in terms of the, you know, we're asking people like Enrico over there for 1 petabit systems, and they're saying, sorry, can't do it. Why not? Okay, so that's one of the challenges we have. And also, can we get it as early as we want? And that's always a challenge. So we're having to work with the suppliers to find more efficient ways to work. So they're not sitting with factories full of cable doing nothing, ships missing ability to install because permits are not available. So becoming more efficient between the two of us is also a challenge we're trying to overcome. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Gary. I'm particularly interested in your three. Sorry, excuse me, to turn my phone off. The three challenges you mentioned. You listed the difficulty of having maintenance vessels available. Being deliberately a bit provocative, I wonder if you would accept that in part Meta is responsible for that. By driving such a hard bargain with the maintenance providers, it's discouraged them over the last few years from making the investments that they would otherwise have made to replace their vessels, and they can now put them to better use in the oil and gas industry, and it's led to the situation we're in now. How would you respond to that?
I'd respond to that very negatively, because the really low prices that are there came about before Meta had a single cable in operation, to be brutally frank and honest. This is all to do with the fight between, at least on the Atlantic, between the ACMA and APMA, which was a bit like the Indian mobile market, fight to the death for the lowest price. So, yeah, I think that's where the fault lies, not with anyone on this panel. But in the future, yes, we have to move further. Nobody has moved a ship, as far as I know, out of marine maintenance into oil and gas. They've just gone off somewhere to rot, or they've gone into the Pacific to be used in a maintenance operation in the Pacific in a different mode. But yes, they're also one big supplier has moved completely out of maintenance, and again, that's something we regret, but we're doing our best to try and make sure that that trend ceases. Otherwise, we'll have very, very difficult way of maintaining and repairing those cables.
I wonder if you can see the day where the hyperscalers might start owning their own fleet of vessels.
Yes, why not? Why not? But we're as you can imagine, we're not a fleet operator. You know, we have a need for maintenance of those. We'd rather work with partners that we have here on the panel here to look at ways to make it more efficient. It's not necessarily a question of lack of tonnage, it's lack of interest. Yeah. And why is there lack of interest? There's no money in it. Why do it? Let's get out. So if we were just to start throwing our own vessels in, then they become inefficient because we'll be having to service Kieran's cable and Nigel's cable, etc. So I'm not sure that is a answer to the question. But whether we should be investing in those suppliers, helping them, yeah, I think that's something that we are actually working on.
It's a funny market, repair, that maintenance, isn't it? Because it's like ambulances. You know, you need it absolutely when you need it, but when you don't give it a second glance when you drive past the ambulance station. And can you really have a typical three-party competitive ambulance service provision, right? People trying to chase to get to the car accident. I mean, it's as complicated as that, and different countries solve it in different ways, and it's always been a problem. I don't think this is going back to the old Atlantic Guardian days 20 years ago, when they tried to create competitive models which never really work because there's no real guarantee that anybody will make some money. And in typically capitalist society, that's not a good thing.
Bottom line, yeah.
No.
I see. Greg, did you want to say something?
You know, I'm dealing with the Med. Obviously, this is a big concern. Maintenance as we get into the move forward with construction and then operations, and so we're having to address that with investors, and they're very keen on this issue. And then our problem obviously extends on, you know, past the Middle East and into India, where it really gets challenging. And so I kind of agree with Gary that at some point you own the problem, and so then it is really about having the right equipment to be efficient and having it available. I guess I'd encourage all of us to kind of think about thinking a little bit broader. If we had more vessels available for maintenance and those vessels were doing installation, there might be a proper mix there between installation work, which they can make a little bit more money, and the maintenance, which we're trying to cut down. And so it's how do you shift between those two that keeps the operator making money and keeps you with availability from multiple sources to take care of a problem. So I, would encourage us to think of like a mesh design almost, as with multiple being able to respond to issues. Now I know there's challenges to that. You got a warehouse, you got to carry inventory, and there's a multitude of problems to what I just said. But we do need some creative thinking to it, and I think Gary's kind of on the forefront of some of that.
Mike, do you want to say something about maintenance? Is it something you have to say about?
For us as a small operator, we'll never have the scale to begin to think about answering that problem ourselves. We're really reliant on the consortium approach, and I think where we come into it is really we're there to improve the economics, and the more of us that really contribute to that rate base that is supporting those assets, those fixed assets, the better.
Kieran, I've got a particular thought about maintenance for your system. So I was involved actually a few years ago as the lawyer for Hibernia when they were building Hibernia Express. And one of the particular features of that cable, which you now own and control and have renamed as, Exa Express, was it was designed to have the lowest possible latency across the Atlantic. And at the time, the issue that created was, there's a reason all the other cables don't go on the shortest route. and that's because it's more that the shortest route is more likely to get cut. It's not the best route from a point of view of ensuring the cable is secure. So my question is, has it been a problem maintaining that system more than any others? And is it fair on the other cable owners on the same region if you're paying the same per kilometre as they are?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a very different landscape when you traditionally we would have built, when you route your network on the seabed, you have a choice and you have optionality and you route around tough territories. With Express, we wanted to follow the Great Circle and we wanted to be as quick as we could. So we had to. The lay operation was certainly very different, but it hasn't been a challenge. I mean, if we look at we're operating these 3 wholly owned cables in the Atlantic for 20 years. That one is only 7 years old. But it has had no more issues than any of the other systems if you look at a time basis. We've seen the challenge certainly change from a maintenance perspective. When we look at vessels and availability, there's more cables there, so naturally these vessels are stretched. The dynamics have changed in terms of cable lay versus maintain, and certainly more attractive for these guys to lay and then maintain. And you see, as Gary said, one of the major providers pull out for similar reasons. We've also had experience with both of the large players, ACMA and APMA, and I think similar challenges. There's definitely an opportunity in terms of the maintenance side for somebody to come in or for more vessels to be converted. But in terms of operating the lower latency cable, it's certainly no more challenging, and the fact that we routed that cable a bit straighter has not had any detriment to the actual system itself. In our experience, it's a lot newer than the other systems, but certainly no greater challenge in terms of where we had to bury, we buried. In challenging areas where we'd see a lot of fishing activity, but then when you get into the deeper areas, no challenges.
Fine. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm remembering some of the heated conversations in negotiation we had about this issue. So it's nice to look back at it a few years later and see what actually happened. Moving on then, I'm interested in your thoughts on the panel about the business case for a new cable. I was talking to Telegeography earlier. It's my phone again. Who are predicting...
It's Kieran's lawyer.
They're Telegeography are predicting one new transatlantic cable is going to be needed every year for the next few years. It's quite remarkable. Does that mean the business case is really very easy? You just look at the enormous growth in demand and build a new one, or do you need a bit more than that? So, Nigel, what do you think?
I mean, business case is always the same. Can you generate enough revenue to pay back the money that you might have to borrow to construct the cable and all those wonderful things? But I think the difference is with some, really enormous parties in the game now, it's not all about just justifying a whole cable. It's about justifying maybe a portion of a cable and, the aggregation of the rest of the traffic around the Atlantic basin that isn't some of the people who are being the construction parties of those cables in the first place. So, I don't disagree with Telegeography, and I didn't really disagree with their claim of a few years ago that there needed to be 41 new cables in the next 15 years. Unfortunately, the construction side of the industry at the moment probably couldn't achieve that, so they're probably maxed out at being able to do one a year. So
maybe that's where investors should look, as be the construction side rather than the cables directly. That's a thought. I'm speaking often to infrastructure investors who, up until the pandemic, were not interested in telecoms at all. I'm wondering if what you're highlighting is another investment opportunity. Anyway, Greg, tell us about the business case.
Well, you do have to, like Nigel's suggestion, is that you've got to bring a broader audience together. So it's not a specific, it's not designed for a specific customer's needs. We face this challenge that we're doing our DLSs from Mumbai to Marseille. And so that type of design will support other folks who don't need that capability and will do shorter DLSs, and they're looking for capacity. So we're supporting all those different business cases in between that people have for different applications that they need. And so we're trying to be an aggregator as a developer. We're going to aggregate all these different uses into a design that will support multiple uses. And so that brings together that you have subsea cables with a lot more fiber pairs in them. And of course, that's good for the industry. It brings down the cost per fiber pair. It does put a demand on you to do a lot more route planning because you've got a lot more responsibility should something go wrong, and you don't want to have that eating you up. So you've got a lot of users, a lot of value in that cable. So you've really got to do it right. Your cable stations, your landings, your backhaul, the whole bit.
Thanks. Mike?
Well, I think Greg touched on part of it in terms of you're seeing, advancement with cables where you can put higher counts in cables in terms of both repeater systems where you used to cap out at 8, and now I think on the roadmap is 32 plus fiber pairs. On the on the non-repeatered side, I mean 96 has kind of been the cap, but you're already seeing people looking to put in higher counts than that. In addition, the optics are improving to the extent you can get more capacity, per fiber pair. So that I think will address a lot of the demand. But despite that, you're still seeing continual price erosion and compression in the market. So in terms of there being really a crunch in terms of supply not being able to meet demand, I think it's still out there quite a bit in the future because you're not seeing that, or you're not seeing it come close to that in the market from a pricing perspective. So I think to the extent that is something that comes to be, it's good for everybody who's got assets, but there would be a challenge just because of the natural constraints there is in terms of bringing new supply to market that benefits existing infrastructure providers.
Thanks. Kieran, X has just announced, I think today, a large new series of investments in infrastructure. So tell us about the business case thinking behind that.
Correct, yeah. I mean, it's very simple for us when we look at a project, we look at demand. What is the project going to solve? Is it a refresh of our network? Is it a new and unique, or is it complementary to our existing asset? So there's many factors or multiple areas of criteria where we would sit down and say, why are we doing this? What does it solve? But at the end of the day, a business case is probably the same for everyone here. It has to have a certain return. So we look at a certain IRR, and if that works, and the timescale works, and the business case makes sense, then it'll be approved. But we do kind of try and de-risk every project. I think when we started building cables, we built them ourselves. These days, you see more joint ventures or consortium. The frameworks are different, and what everyone's doing there is really de-risking their project to increase their level of return. So for us, it's a very simple base case. It has to return within a certain time at a certain level. But also we try and make sure that it's solving a problem for us, whether it's a new and unique route, whether it's enhancing our existing network, or whether it's a replacement. So there's multiple factors in any business case that we run, but ultimately, our owners, private equity, they certainly need to see a business case that makes sense. And it has to be de-risked to a certain level in terms of cost. So it's very similar across all our projects. We have recently announced quite a few new projects, so we have that committed capex. Putting it to work now is where we have to focus and concentrate. But every business case for us is pretty similar.
It strikes me, Gary, that things might be a bit different for Meta. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I imagine that you don't have to come up with a particular business case that looks at how many dollars you're going to get back from each cable you invest in. That at least to some extent, you're thinking, well, if we improve the connectivity to this region, I'm thinking about To Africa here as an obvious example, more people in this region are going to use Meta's services, and that's going to, so it's an unusual way to kind of build a business case. Am I right, or have I got the wrong end of the stick?
Yeah, I think To Africa is very different investment for us. Also involved a lot of partnership and a lot of complex partnership deals that are not public. So that whole investment was very much a business case that Mark had to sign off. So, and that was unusual for us. But on transatlantic, we don't have to follow the same area. We have a demand that we have to match, and God help us if we don't provide the amount of capacity in time for it to be consumed. So that's where we're following on the Atlantic. But going back to your original question of one cable per year transatlantic, honestly, I don't foresee that.
So you say you don't foresee that, did you say? I didn't hear that.
Sorry?
I didn't catch what you said. Did you say you don't agree? You don't think that's right, the one?
No, not one cable per year, absolutely not. One every 2 years perhaps, but going back to what Greg was discussing, what is a cable, you know? Apollo, you know, 4 fibre pairs at maybe 10 terabits max, you know. Then we go to projects like HAFRU, which is, you know, 8 fibre pairs at 20 odd terabits each. And then you go to Amity, 16 fibre pairs at 23 terabits. And then you go to the new one that we're building with NEC at 24 fibre pairs. So what isn't a cable? Okay, I think the growth is right, but it's how many fibre pairs are in the cable is the other factor. And then what is the next cable that comes along after that? How many are the equivalent fibre pairs? You know, whether it's C plus L, whether it's multi-core, can we get to a second generation cable? What is that equivalent to? Is that equivalent to 5 Apollo cables in one? So
certainly, you know, as a lawyer in the sector, one of the things I think so exciting is the technological change you just mentioned. Just means that every year there's something new, and it has an impact on the business cases and on the business models. You know, so I can see if you're building systems with 24 fibre pairs or more, then that's going to create a market that barely exists at the moment for individual fibre pairs on systems. So it's all very exciting. But whilst we're talking about the technology, I see we've had a question in. Will we see a hollow core cable installed across the Atlantic? Now, help out a poor lawyer. Someone tell me what is a hollow core cable before answering the question as to whether we'll see one across the Atlantic.
I think it's a hollow core fibre cable, what they mean, which is a very low latency technique between very short points. So for transatlantic, not in the next 40 years, in my humble opinion.
Anyone have a different opinion?
A little bit too far for hollow core.
Not technically possible yet. Right.
Multi-core. Multi-core. If that was a typo, if it meant multi-core, yes. Yeah.
I see.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the technology has changed. You can see the spacing between repeater sets has changed dramatically over the last few years, but certainly we're not there in hollow core yet. Transatlantic, that's more of a short haul play, more of a metro.
The spacing between repeaters has got bigger or smaller?
Bigger.
Bigger, right. Because the repeaters are better now than they were.
The technology has allowed for larger distances before amplification is needed. So yes, it's completely changed.
Okay, bring me on to more of a legal question, because of course I would have to do that. There is a number of different legal structures that there are out there for how you manage an investment. You could have a joint venture, you can have a consortium, you can have a kind of the kind of joint build agreement style now, where it's a consortium where individual fibres are owned by individual members of the consortium. Do you have a view as to which makes the most sense, or are you just going to tell me it depends? Yeah, Nigel.
I mean, I quite like the more recent joint build agreements where fibre pairs are owned. I mean, from an investor's point of view, there's a clear route to ownership, and you're not just acquiring something that's already been developed. But I actually don't see any problem with that either. You know, I don't see the need to be completely involved in construction if the construction's been done to industry standards and by people who've got a vested interest in having a good quality product. I mean,
one issue that I've seen with the joint build agreement structure is that if one of the or a number of the members are trying to get project finance, then it's a bit of a challenge for the bank to understand what security they have, and they've got 2 fibres in a 12 fibre system which they can't separate out, and they don't own the repeaters or the power feed equipment, etc.
Yeah.
So I can see issues there. Greg, what do you think?
Well, I think the more challenging the project you have, you really need a person to solve those problems, drive the project to success. So I guess it would be relative to the nature of the problem that you're solving, where the cable's being put, what issues you're having to resolve. You know, if you're in a difficult situation, you really need a simple structure to be able to move things, handle issues. So a little bit of it depends upon the nature of the problem.
If anyone else on the panel has got anything to add on this legal structure, please do pipe up. But otherwise, I won't make you, repeat what others have been saying.
So just simplistically, why the finance guys can't understand it if you've got 1/24th or something, you've got 1/24th of that. And before, if you had an IRU on a bunch of capacity, then that was something of value. But 1/24th of a system, 1/24th of a condominium, 1/24th of a tower block, what is the problem of understanding that there's a value in that?
You're right, maybe it's just a question of them getting comfortable with it, but my experience has been what the banks look for is the ability, in theory, to step in and take over if the debtor can't, defaults on the loan. And if what the debtor owns is the fibres but not the repeaters, then they've got to be comfortable that if they step in, they'll still be able to make use of them.
Yeah, but they don't know. The joint build agreements aren't on the fibres, aren't on the amperes. It's on a participation basis, and what that potentially gives you is the access to X number of fibre pairs.
Yeah.
In terms of the title of what you own, it's on a participation interest, and that's there to try and protect the investment value.
I think you're right. I think in the end, it will just be the banks will get used to it. They'll realise how this works. It's just not something they've yet seen much of because it's quite a new model, isn't it?
But it's not, and they, I'm not having a crack back at the lawyer, but frankly, banking lawyers make things incredibly complicated for absolutely no reason whatsoever, other than billing time. So, parties probably would recognise that elsewhere. I mean, if you have the asset that you have is the asset that can be stepped into. So get comfortable or don't lend the money. Do what you want. I
don't try and defend banking lawyers, and I'm not a banking lawyer myself. I'm happy to say, but yeah, I think it's a question of thinking through exactly how make sure you can step into everything that's necessary. But stepping into the joint build agreement might not be enough. You might need to also step into the landing party arrangements, the maintenance arrangements, and that's. You have to make sure that that's possible. Not to say it can't be done; it can be.
But it's about understanding what you're financing as well. That's there's a duty of care on them to understand what they're financing. It's the same in farming. It's the same in a whole range of different things. You just have to understand it, and sometimes there are natural ways. And I think for 40 years we've had decent natural ways of proving, the capability to gain an asset if needs to from a bankruptcy. We've had so many of them, right? We should be really good at it.
That's a good point. Or let's move on to another question, perhaps the last one. The time to develop new systems seems to have gone down. Now you can do it now quite quickly from design to RFS. What impact does that have? Well, first of all, am I right? Is my perception right? And secondly, if I am right, what impact does that have? Mike, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, I think the business case is something that definitely in the last number of years has shortened. After the dot-com boom, it was very difficult to develop the business case and get the appropriate level of pre-sales and comfort in the market that you would be able to get a return. So I think that is shortened greatly. I think the different commercial models has further accelerated that development time frame from a commercial perspective. From a supply perspective, I think it's going in the other direction now. I think that there's constraints on the supply chain. I think there's a limited number of resources that are capable to do installation, and I think that's a pressure that is on the other side of the equation lengthening the amount of time it will take to develop a cable. So I think from a market perspective, it's probably as quick as it's ever been. Right now, or at least since the dot-com boom when it was entirely speculative. But within the last 20 years, I think it's extremely quick from that perspective. But from a supply perspective and from a permitting perspective, I think there's pressures that are elongating the timeframes to develop a cable.
Thanks. Greg, do you want to respond to that?
Not much to add to
Okay, no, that's fine.
particular thing. No.
Nigel, what do you think?
I think there's probably some short-term challenges, but I don't think it's got easier or harder. I mean, if you had the money right now and you put it down, there's still a natural flow based on what Gary said right at the beginning, primarily permits. You know, you can't, there's a periodicity to getting countries used to this, and that's increased in time. You know, some of the environmental permitting analysis factors in Europe particularly have added big chunks of time. So some countries are trying to make it easier and make it a slicker process, but there's still a kind of a periodicity. You know, if you have to study things, you have to take that period of time to study them, and so I don't know that it's got quicker, but it's the same factors, and you know, you apply yourself to those factors, and it potentially takes longer to make a kilometre of 24 fibre pair cable than it does to make a kilometre of 6 fibre pair cable. Maybe not a bit, but certainly it's not quicker, I don't think.
Greg? Yeah.
I guess I would add that, you know, there are routes where things do work, like as was mentioned, with jurisdictions that understand subsea and they get it and they have a process, and that's true. A shortened business time to get the whole thing done happens. However, it's a bad generalization to apply to other countries which are just getting their second, third cable. They haven't done it in 20 years. They can't even find anybody that knows what a subsea cable is in the country. And so you have this huge gap, and that's, I think, is what I heard here with Nigel, that as a result, it's actually longer. I mean, they're scrambling, trying to figure out how to deal with all the issues. And so it happens in the region that we're talking about.
Kieran, are you seeing issues caused by supply shortages and inflation making it difficult to plan or to build?
Yeah, definitely. I think everybody's seeing the same thing, and it's not just our industry, it's across multiple industries. But I think the design process of these systems has largely unchanged. I mean, the design process is, I guess, the easy piece. The manufacturing, we've seen delays, material supply delays, but also, as Gary and Nigel mentioned, permitting has the permitting process, the foreshore licensing applications. There's a lot of different types of delays, and again, as Greg said, it depends on where you're landing and if that's a unique zone or if it's a location that is not is not heavily utilized. There's different complexities around different landings, but the process is the same. It's really the implementation, the vessel availability. You've got to get in the queue pretty early. You've got to get your planning cycles way ahead of time in terms of manufacturing of cable, but also the vessels. So I think the challenge is really around implementation. So these projects do take a lot longer, I would say, than they used to because of those factors, but I don't think the design process has changed a whole lot. Technology has changed, but the process has stayed the same largely, but it's really around implementation. That's really where the challenge is, yeah.
Gary, as a final word, have you got anything you'd like to add on this question of time?
Just as we were saying before, many systems are growing in the number of fibre pairs. So if you've got a 2 or 4 fibre pair system, compare that to a 24 fibre pair system. You've got to select, you've got to colour, you've got to splice, you've got to assemble not just 4 fibre pairs, but 24 fibre pairs. You've got to build, test and assemble and commission not just 4 amplified pairs, but 24 amplified pairs. Put all that together in a whole supply chain and deliver that, and then commission it. Despite the scaling up of the suppliers, it's not happening any quicker than it was before. So delivery times reducing, not seeing that from my side.
Okay, good. I think that just about calls our time to an end. Thanks very much to our panel. Really interesting conversation. If you could please thank them in the usual way. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Great to have a bit of back and forth as well there. So thank you, Mike. I'd like to thank all of our sponsors. We've got another session looking this time at the Pacific, which will be starting, well, in a couple of moments when we pull a chair off and swap the water out. So if you want to stick around for that, that would be great. Thank you all.